It started with a knock so hard it shook the front door, the kind that makes your heart jump before you even reach the handle. When I opened it, an HOA woman stood there clutching a clipboard, jaw tight, eyes already darting past me toward the sidewalk. That's when I saw my teenage son standing there, frozen in place, a plastic bucket of chalk hanging from his hand like evidence at a crime scene. She didn't acknowledge me at all. Instead, she stared straight at him and said, "You know this is vandalism, right? Vandalism for sidewalk chalk." Just minutes earlier, he'd been laughing with the neighborhood kids, drawing hopscotch squares and silly faces on the sidewalk. The same harmless drawings kids on this street had made for years without a single complaint. But that day, the HOA decided to draw a line, and they chose my kid to make their point. She threatened fines, hinted at police involvement, and even said she would document him if it happened again. Something in me snapped right then, because this wasn't just about chalk anymore. And it definitely wasn't just about my family. By the end of that week, the entire street would be involved, and they'd be showing up with buckets of chalk of their own. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? We live in a quiet little place called Maple Ridge Estates, tucked just outside the fictional town of Hollow Creek, Indiana. It's the kind of neighborhood developers love to advertise as peaceful and family-friendly. Neatly trimmed lawns, tree-lined streets, rows of identical mailboxes standing at attention like soldiers. From the outside, it looks perfect, and for the most part, it was. But like most places with an HOA, that piece came with fine print. Usually, the HOA was just background noise. A reminder slipped into the mailbox about grass being a half-inch too tall. A warning email about trash cans needing to be pulled in before sunset. Annoying, sure, but nothing worth losing sleep over. You roll your eyes, fix the problem, and move on. I'm Daniel Foster, mid-40s, working from home, married to my wife Laura. We've lived here long enough to feel settled, and we're raising our son Ethan, who was 14 at the time. Ethan's a good kid. Loud laugh, messy room, and just rebellious enough to test boundaries without ever crossing into real trouble. If anything, he's the kind of kid you want growing up next door. One of the things Ethan loved most was playing outside. And in Maple Ridge Estates, sidewalk chalk had always been part of that. Kids drew hopscotch grids, goofy cartoons, inside jokes only they understood. Sometimes they wrote welcome messages when someone new moved in or birthday notes for a friend. The rain always washed it away in a day or two. Nobody complained, nobody cared. It was harmless. That changed when Marilyn Crow became HOA president. Marilyn had been elected about 6 months earlier, and almost immediately the tone of the neighborhood shifted. She talked a lot about raising standards and protecting property values. Rules weren't just enforced anymore, they were clarified, which somehow always meant stricter. Enforcement got aggressive. She started driving around the neighborhood in her white SUV like a hall monitor, slowly cruising the streets, phone in hand, snapping photos of anything she thought might be a violation. At first, it was small stuff. Someone's trash can left out too long. A lawn ornament that hadn't been approved. But then it got personal. The chalk incident wasn't even our first run-in with her. A few weeks earlier, we'd received a warning letter about Ethan riding his bike too close to the road. That one made no sense at all since he was riding on the sidewalk, the same sidewalk that ran parallel to the road through the entire neighborhood. I brushed it off as Marilyn being overly picky and figured that would be the end of it. I was wrong. This time, she didn't just leave a letter. She didn't send an email. She showed up at our door and went straight for my kid, and that crossed a line. That night, after everything settled down, Ethan came into the kitchen while I was looking over paperwork. His shoulders were slumped, his voice quiet. He asked me if he was in trouble. Then he started apologizing. Over and over, he said he didn't know chalk wasn't allowed. He said he wouldn't do it again. He even offered to throw the chalk away. That hit me harder than the HOA threat ever could. My son felt guilty for something he hadn't done wrong. I told him to go to his room and relax, but I could tell he was shaken, so I did what any frustrated homeowner does. I pulled out the HOA handbook. The same thick packet of rules I'd skimmed when we first moved in and mostly ignored ever since. I went through it carefully this time. Page by page. Landscaping regulations. Approved paint colors. Fence heights. Holiday decoration timelines down to the exact day you were supposed to take lights down. There were rules about satellite dishes, basketball hoops, even garden gnomes. But sidewalk chalk? Nothing. Not a single word. I checked again, thinking maybe I'd missed it. Still nothing. That was the moment it fully clicked. Marilyn wasn't enforcing the rules anymore. She was making them up as she went along. And if she was willing to invent rules to intimidate a 14-year-old kid, there was no telling who would be next. The next morning, I decided to handle it calmly. I sat down at my desk, pulled up the HOA handbook, and wrote Marilyn an email that was polite to the point of being careful. I cited the handbook directly. I explained that the chalk had already been washed away by the rain overnight. I even attached photos of the clean sidewalk, just to remove any doubt. All I asked was simple, for her to show me the specific rule Ethan had supposedly violated. Her response came less than an hour later. She didn't reference a rule at all. Instead, she leaned on something far more vague, what she called community standards. According to Marilyn, sidewalk chalk was visual clutter and could be perceived as graffiti by prospective buyers. She warned me that any future incidents would result in a fine of $100 per occurrence, not per day or drawing. I stared at the screen for a long moment, rereading the email to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. She had gone from scolding a kid to threatening our family financially, all without pointing to a single written rule. I forwarded the email to Laura while she was at work. Her reply came back almost instantly. One word: unbelievable. But the real fuse was lit later that afternoon. Marilyn sent a follow-up email. This time, it wasn't just addressed to me. It was addressed directly to Ethan, using his full legal name. She'd pulled it straight from HOA records. The language was formal and cold, warning him that further violations would be documented and escalated. Seeing my 14-year-old son addressed like a repeat offender made my blood boil. It felt invasive. It felt threatening. And more than anything, it felt wrong. HOA or not, no adult should be targeting a kid like that. I didn't email her back. I grabbed the handbook, got in my car, and drove straight to her house. Marilyn answered the door with a tight, rehearsed smile, like she already knew why I was there and didn't care. I asked her, calmly at first, to show me where in the rules sidewalk chalk was prohibited. I even held up the handbook, flipped open, ready. She barely glanced at it. Instead, she shrugged and said, "It doesn't need to be written if it affects property values." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. There was no conversation to be had, no compromise. No reasoning with someone who believed their personal opinion carried the same weight as written rules. I left before I said something I'd regret, but I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Over the next few days, the tension spread through the neighborhood like a bad rumor. I started hearing stories from other parents while checking the mail or taking out the trash. Tom Reynolds from across the street told me Marilyn had warned his daughter for drawing flowers near their driveway. Angela Brooks said her twin boys were told to scrub the sidewalk immediately or face consequences. Every story sounded the same. No written rule, just threats, just pressure. And it worked. Kids stopped playing outside. Chalk buckets disappeared from porches. The sidewalks, once full of color and laughter, went back to bare gray concrete. The neighborhood felt quieter, but not in a good way. It felt tense, like everyone was waiting for the next knock on the door. Ethan noticed it too. One evening, he asked if it was okay to go outside at all. That question hit me harder than anything Marilyn had said. A kid shouldn't feel nervous about stepping onto his own sidewalk. That was when my frustration shifted into something else. This wasn't about chalk anymore. It was about intimidation. It was about an HOA president who thought fear was an acceptable tool, even when it came to children. And it was clear that if someone didn't push back, she'd keep going. I stopped thinking about how unfair it was and started thinking about what I could do. Because once fear takes hold, it only grows, unless someone stands up and refuses to let it. The turning point came from someone I least expected. I was walking back from the mailbox one morning, still stewing over everything, when Mrs. Helen Carter waved me down from her front porch. Helen was in her 70s, a retired school teacher who had lived on our street since Maple Ridge Estates was first built. She was the kind of neighbor who remembered birthdays, baked too much banana bread, and somehow always knew what was going on without ever gossiping. She looked at me over her glasses and said, "Daniel, can I ask you something?" I told her, of course, and that's when she leaned in a little and said, "Did you know the sidewalks aren't HOA property?" That stopped me cold. I told her I assumed they were, like everything else around here. She shook her head slowly, the way teachers do when you get an answer wrong, but they're trying not to embarrass you. "No," she said. They never were. Helen explained that when the neighborhood was built, the sidewalks were designated as public easements. The town maintained them, not the HOA. The association could make rules about lawns and houses, but the sidewalks? Those belonged to the town of Hollow Creek. She disappeared inside her house for a moment and came back with a thick folder, edges worn and yellowed with age. Inside were copies of original development documents, maps, and correspondence she'd saved from when the neighborhood was first approved. She'd kept everything, neatly labeled, just like you'd expect from a former teacher. "There," she said, tapping one page with her finger. "Public access easement. Clear as day." My heart started pounding, but this time it wasn't anger. It was something else, hope. That night, after dinner, I decided to double-check everything myself. I didn't want to get excited over a misunderstanding. I called the Hollow Creek Municipal Office and explained the situation. The woman on the phone didn't even hesitate. She confirmed it immediately. The sidewalks were public. The HOA had no authority over them at all. Then I asked the question that had been burning in my mind. Was sidewalk chalk illegal? She actually laughed. "No," she said. "Sidewalk chalk on public walkways is completely legal. It washes away. We get calls like this more often than you'd think." I hung up the phone and just sat there for a moment, letting it sink in. Marilyn wasn't just being strict. She wasn't just misinterpreting rules. She was bluffing. She had been threatening families and kids over something she had no power to control. I felt angry all over again, but this time it was different. The fear I'd been carrying for days was gone. In its place was clarity. The next step was obvious. I started sharing what I'd learned. I talked to Tom Reynolds first, then Angela Brooks. I showed them the documents Helen had shared and explained what the town had confirmed. You could see the shift happen in real time. Their shoulders straightened. Their voices changed. The nervous energy melted into frustration, then into something stronger. Word spread fast. Conversations popped up in driveways, over fences, and in the neighborhood group chat. Every parent seemed to have their own story, their own moment where Marilyn had leaned on intimidation instead of rules. And with every conversation, the mood changed. Fear turned into anger. Anger turned into resolve. Someone, I don't even remember who, made a half-joking comment in the group chat. "So technically," they wrote, "we could all draw at once." At first, people responded with laughing emojis, but then someone else said, "Why not?" That's when the joke stopped being a joke. I stared at my phone, rereading the messages as they came in. Parents chimed in. Kids overheard and got excited. The idea started taking shape without anyone formally planning it. If the sidewalks were public and chalk was legal, then there was nothing Marilyn could do about it. And more importantly, if we all did it together, she couldn't single anyone out. That night, Ethan noticed me smiling for the first time in days. I told him he wasn't in trouble. I told him the chalk wasn't illegal. I told him the HOA never had the right to threaten him in the first place. The relief on his face said everything. For the first time since that knock on the door, I felt like we weren't just reacting anymore. We were taking control of the situation, not through shouting, not through threats, but through knowledge and unity. And that little joke about everyone drawing at once, it was about to turn into something Marilyn Crowe never saw coming. Once we knew the truth, the fear disappeared almost overnight. What replaced it was resolve. We weren't looking to cause trouble, and we weren't trying to provoke anyone. We just wanted to make a point, legally, peacefully, and out in the open where no one could twist the story. The plan came together faster than I expected. We picked Saturday morning, late enough that people could sleep in, early enough that it felt like a neighborhood event instead of a protest. The idea was simple. Families would come outside and decorate the sidewalks with chalk. Nothing rude, nothing aggressive, just color, games, and positive messages that reminded everyone this was a place where kids lived and played. I set up a neighborhood group chat that evening and explained what we'd learned. I shared screenshots from the town website, photos of Helen's documents, and a summary of what the municipal office confirmed. I told everyone the sidewalks were public and chalk was completely legal. Then I added one line at the end: if anyone wants to let their kids draw on Saturday morning, we'll be out there too. The response was immediate. Parents reacted first. Messages poured in saying how relieved they were, how angry they'd been but didn't know what to do. Then the kids got involved, borrowing their parents' phones to send excited voice messages about what they wanted to draw. Someone suggested bringing extra chalk for anyone who didn't have any. Someone else offered lemonade. Another neighbor joked about making it a chalk party. By Friday night, the group chat wouldn't stop buzzing. It felt like the whole street had been waiting for permission to breathe again. Saturday morning came, and I'll never forget stepping outside and seeing cars already parked along the curb. Families were walking toward our block, carrying buckets, boxes, and grocery bags filled with chalk. Some kids dragged wagons behind them. Others clutched handfuls of bright colors like treasure. More than 20 families showed up. People who barely spoke before were suddenly laughing together. Parents waved. Kids ran up and down the sidewalk, already planning their drawings. Ethan stood next to me, eyes wide, taking it all in. He looked up at me and said, "Dad, is this really happening?" I smiled and told him yes. It was. The sidewalks transformed in less than an hour. Hopscotch grids stretched down the block. Rainbows crossed driveways. Smiley faces appeared next to sons and stick figure families. Someone wrote, "Kids live here," in big block letters. Another family wrote, "Community, not control." Near the corner, a little girl carefully spelled out, "Be kind," with hearts around it. It wasn't loud or chaotic, it was joyful. It felt like the neighborhood I thought we moved into all those years ago. And right on schedule, Marilyn arrived. Her white SUV rolled to a stop at the corner of the street. She stepped out slowly, clipboard under one arm, phone already raised. Her jaw was clenched so tight you could see it from across the block. She started taking photos, pivoting in place like she was trying to capture every square inch of chalk. But this time, nobody froze. Nobody panicked. Parents kept talking. Kids kept drawing. A few people glanced her way, then went right back to what they were doing. She marched toward us, clearly ready to say something. I could see it in her posture. But before she got a word out, Tom Reynolds stepped forward calmly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply held out a piece of paper. It was a printed copy of the county ordinance, clearly stating the sidewalks were public easements and chalk was permitted. Marilyn stopped short. She looked at the paper. Then she looked at Tom. Then she scanned the street full of families, kids, and drawings. For the first time since all this started, she didn't seem sure of herself. She didn't say a word. She lowered her phone, folded the paper once without reading it fully, and turned around. She walked back to her SUV, got inside, and drove away. No threats, no warnings, no fines, just silence. Ethan watched her leave, then looked back at the sidewalk covered in color. He picked up a piece of blue chalk and knelt down, drawing a giant hopscotch grid right in front of our house. That moment made everything worth it. The chalk on the sidewalks hadn't even faded yet when the HOA announced an emergency meeting. The email went out late Sunday night, flagged as urgent, with language that felt more like a warning than an invitation. Attendance was strongly encouraged. That alone told me Marilyn was furious and scrambling. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday evening at the community center. By the time Laura and I arrived, the parking lot was already overflowing. I recognized faces I'd never seen at HOA meetings before. Parents, grandparents, even a few neighbors who normally avoided anything HOA related like the plague. Whatever Marilyn had hoped this meeting would accomplish, it was clear she wasn't prepared for this many people. Inside, the room buzzed with tension. Chairs scraped loudly against the floor as people squeezed in. Conversations overlapped. Kids sat next to parents, quietly listening. Marilyn stood at the front with the rest of the board, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. She opened the meeting abruptly, without her usual small talk. She accused us of staging a protest. She claimed the chalk event was an organized act of defiance, meant to undermine the HOA's authority. She said property values were at risk and that she'd been forced to act to protect the community. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and took a breath. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue emotionally. I laid out the facts. I explained that the sidewalks were public easements. I cited county documents. I referenced the municipal office. I held up printed copies so anyone could see for themselves. Then I asked one simple question that made the room go quiet. If the HOA has no authority over the sidewalks, why were children being threatened with fines and documentation? That's when everything changed. Hands shot up around the room. One by one, neighbors stood to share their experiences. Parents talked about warning letters, emails, doorstep confrontations, kids being scared to go outside. The stories were consistent, and they were damning. Marilyn tried to interrupt. She tried to redirect, but the board chair finally told her to let people speak. The room turned against her quickly, not with shouting, but with clarity. The more people talked, the more obvious it became that she'd been acting alone, using fear instead of rules. Then came the moment no one expected. Angela Brooks stood up and said there was something else the board should know. She'd done some checking of her own. According to HOA guidelines, all exterior structures required written approval. She turned toward Marilyn and said, "Does your shed have approval?" You could feel the air shift. Someone else pulled up photos. Marilyn's backyard shed was visible from the alley. It hadn't been on the approval list. The board members exchanged glances. Papers shuffled. Marilyn tried to deflect, saying it was temporary, that it didn't count. The board didn't agree. After a brief closed discussion right there at the table, the board chair cleared his throat and announced that Marilyn's authority as HOA president was being suspended pending a formal review. Marilyn's face went red. She stood up so fast her chair nearly tipped over. She accused the board of betrayal, accused the neighbors of manipulation, and stormed out of the room. The door slammed behind her. For the first time since all of this began, the room felt calm. And everyone knew things would never go back to the way they were. The 2 weeks that followed the emergency meeting felt longer than the months before it. Everything was quiet on the surface, but underneath, the neighborhood was holding its breath. Marilyn had been suspended from her role, but she still lived among us. Her white SUV stayed parked in her driveway. The chalk drawings slowly faded from the sidewalks, replaced by watchful glances and whispered updates in the group chat. The board moved faster than anyone expected. They requested official records from the town. They reviewed email chains, warning notices, and photos Marilyn had taken. They interviewed parents, homeowners, and even a few of the kids who'd been directly targeted. What became clear was impossible to ignore. Marilyn hadn't just overstepped once or twice. She had established a pattern of intimidation, particularly toward families with children, and she'd done it without the authority to back it up. When the decision was finally announced, it came in the form of a formal letter delivered to every homeowner. Marilyn Crowe was officially removed as HOA president. The letter didn't sugarcoat it. It stated that she had acted beyond the scope of her authority, misrepresented HOA powers, and created a hostile environment within the community. The board acknowledged that her actions had caused unnecessary stress, especially for families with minors. For the first time since this started, I felt a real sense of relief. But the letter didn't stop there. The board issued a written apology to every household that had received warnings related to sidewalk chalk or similar activities. All previous warnings and threats were formally rescinded and removed from HOA records. It was made clear that no fines would be issued and no documentation would be kept against any resident or child. Then came the policy changes. A new guideline was adopted to explicitly protect children's outdoor activities, including sidewalk chalk, biking, and street games, as long as they were safe and lawful. The language was clear and unambiguous, written specifically to prevent anyone from ever pulling a stunt like this again. Parents in the neighborhood cried when they read it. Some admitted they hadn't realized how tense they'd been until that pressure was finally gone. And then there was the final detail: the shed. During the review process, the board confirmed what Angela had uncovered. Marilyn's backyard shed had never been submitted for approval. It violated HOA guidelines regarding exterior structures, setbacks, and visibility. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The board ordered it removed. She was given a deadline and a formal notice, just like she'd given so many others. No exceptions. No community standards, loopholes. Just the rules applied exactly as written. Neighbors didn't celebrate publicly. There were no cheers or gloating. But there were knowing looks, quiet smiles. A shared sense that balance had been restored. When Ethan heard the news, he didn't cheer either. He just asked if he could go outside and draw again. I told him yes. That night, the sidewalks lit up with color once more. Hopscotch grids reappeared. New drawings joined old memories. The neighborhood felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted. Marilyn stayed inside. Poetic justice doesn't always arrive with fireworks or applause. Sometimes it comes in the form of a letter, a removed title, and a shed that has to be torn down piece by piece. And sometimes that's more than enough. After Marilyn was removed, the change in the neighborhood was almost immediate. It wasn't something dramatic you could point to in a single moment. It was subtle, quiet, and steady, like a deep breath everyone had been holding, finally being released. Kids came back outside. At first, it was just one or two families, a bike rolling down the sidewalk, a basketball thumping in a driveway. Then, little by little, the streets filled again. Laughter carried farther. Chalk buckets reappeared on porches. Within days, the sidewalks looked like they used to, covered in bright colors, half-finished games, and drawings that made no sense unless you were a kid. No one panicked anymore when a car slowed down. No one rushed kids inside at the sound of an engine. The fear that had settled over the neighborhood had lifted. The HOA changed too, and this time for the better. Meetings were announced well in advance and held in open spaces instead of closed rooms. Agendas were shared ahead of time. Homeowners were encouraged to speak, not rushed or shut down. The board made it clear that enforcement would be based on written rules only. No interpretations, no personal opinions dressed up as authority. They even invited feedback when revising policies. That alone felt revolutionary. For the first time since we'd moved in, it felt like the HOA worked for the community instead of against it. Ethan never forgot the chalk day. He talks about it like it was a parade thrown just for him. He remembers the colors, the laughter, the way adults showed up without being asked. To him, it wasn't about rules or ordinances. It was about feeling protected. One evening, weeks later, he asked me why so many neighbors had helped. I told him the truth. Sometimes adults forget how important small things are until someone threatens to take them away. And sometimes, all it takes is one person pushing too far to remind everyone else what really matters. The experience changed me too. Before all this, I would have described myself as someone who avoided conflict. I paid the fees, followed the rules, and kept my head down. This situation taught me that silence can be permission, and fear can spread just as fast as courage. Standing up didn't require a lawyer. It didn't require a lawsuit. It didn't require shouting or insults. It required information, calm voices, and neighbors willing to stand shoulder to shoulder when it counted. Maple Ridge Estates didn't become perfect overnight. HOAs never do, but it became fairer. Kinder, more human, more human. And every time I see chalk washing away after a rainstorm, I don't think about rules anymore. I think about how quickly a community can come together when it remembers who the neighborhood is really for. Looking back now, it still amazes me how something as small and harmless as sidewalk chalk exposed so much about power, fear, and what a community really is. One person tried to rule through intimidation, believing people would stay quiet and comply. Instead, she pushed too far and ended up uniting an entire street that barely spoke to each other before. What stayed with me the most wasn't the meeting, the documents, or even the outcome. It was watching my son learn an important lesson in real time. He saw that standing up for yourself doesn't always mean fighting alone or being the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it means trusting that others feel the same way and finding the courage to stand together. Now, every time it rains and the chalk slowly fades from the sidewalks, I catch myself smiling. Not because it's gone, but because I know it'll be back. The kids will come out again with their buckets. The games will restart. The laughter will carry down the street like it always should have. That chalk became a reminder that neighborhoods aren't just houses lined up next to each other. They're people. They're shared spaces. And when those spaces are protected by the community instead of controlled by fear, something special happens. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?